right, so I'm Anna Naupa. I'm the moderator for this session. I'm with ANU, the School of Culture, History and Language, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce what is the largest panel in this conference. And why is it the largest panel? Well, I think we'll get to hear more about it, but given that our topic is human security, which is it's a matter that affects us all. It's a key focus of the Boe Declaration and the Pacific 2050 strategy. And it is a very broad aspect to security as we know it. And so we wanted to, we're really excited to have the panelists who can speak to the breadth of human security. So I'm going to introduce them. And it's really great. They've actually sat in the order I wrote this down without us speaking. So we're on the same wavelength. So Benny Teoa, sorry if I pronounced that wrong, is the Secretary for Health and Medical Services from Kiribati. And she's worked previously in Foreign Affairs as serving as First Secretary to the Kiribati High Commission here in Suva. She's also been posted to the UN mission for Kiribati in New York, where she was a speechwriter for the president of the 76th UNGA. And so she's done a range of work across health, employment, women, youth, sports, social affairs, foreign affairs and immigration. We also have Dr. Francis Vakauta, who comes to us from SPC by way of Fiji, and is the team leader for Culture for Development at SPC. She was previously the Associate Professor and Director of the Oceania Centre here at USP La Thala, where the Oceania Centre looked at arts, culture and Pacific studies. She has had over 2 decades of teaching at higher education levels, and she's very passionate about Pacific arts and artists and has just come to us from FESPAC in Hawaii. So a lot of celebration of arts and culture and stories, and no doubt from there. But also, importantly, Francis is an advocate for safeguarding our traditional Indigenous knowledge and social policy that supports cultural resilience. Dr. Nick Thompson, to my right, your left, is the academic convener at the Pacific Security College. I just learned he's a trained epidemiologist and as well as a public health and human rights specialist, and he's done work on HIV prevention in Southeast Asia, public health responses and infectious diseases in complex settings, working also, I think, in South and Central Asia and Eastern Europe. And he looks at the intersection of security, public health and civil society. So very interested to hear from Nick as well. Dr. Eric Rafai comes to us by way of Rotuma. And he is the One Health Coordinator at SPC. He started there last year, but he comes after over 20 years of working with Fiji's Ministry of Health and Medical Services, and where he's been overseeing research, innovation and data management initiatives in Fiji, as well as being quite pivotal in advancing pandemic preparation. I'm going to get this word wrong, zoonotic management and food safety. So a lot of preparedness and pandemic preparedness work. Saui'a Dr. Louise Mataia-Milo. Mataia-Milo is the Dean at the Faculty of Arts at the National University of Samoa, where she's been for over 20 years in the history department. Her work is deeply rooted in the history and culture of the Pacific, and has had a focus on Samoan migration and popular culture during the colonial period, but also looking at the participation of Pacific peoples in international conflicts such as during World War I and World War II. And you're currently working on a manuscript about Samoan women's experiences during World War II. So as a Samoan woman Matai, she holds a respected title that also reflects her dedication and activities with her communities in Samoa. So without further ado, I wanted to kick us off. As you can see, we've got a range of backgrounds, a range of experience here. But to think about what is human security and what does it mean? Was it just an add-on in the Boe Declaration? And you know, that was me being cheeky. But what does it really mean and how we then approach it? And so I'd like to ask Benny to kick us off, please, to think about how do we, what is the aspect of human security that worries you most in Kiribati, and how does your country think about human security and what's most important?
Thank you, Anna. Well, human security is premised on livelihood and well-being, and for Kiribati, especially in the context of health, the major priorities are building resilient healthcare systems, and that is what we're really focusing on. In the context of building resilient healthcare systems, we really look at this in the context of climate change, because as you know, climate change, it impacts a whole lot of a plethora of policies. It affects the quality of water, and essentially also the services and the access to healthcare services. And so what we're looking at is really building resilience for our primary healthcare services. As you know, Kiribati is an island made of, it's a country made of dispersed islands, and we have 22 habitable islands. Across those islands, we have 113 public health clinics. And so it's really about strengthening the services of these primary healthcare services. We do not have doctors on the outer islands. And so those primary healthcare services, those public health clinics are the focal point of healthcare services. They are the primary focal point of healthcare services. And so it is essential prevention. And that's what we're working on at the moment, is strengthening our public primary healthcare services on the outer islands as part of building resilience. The other point I wanted to make as a priority is we're looking also into working on building the capacity of our workforce. Obviously, there's been a brain drain. As much as we have been grateful for labour mobility, that has had a huge impact and a huge blow on our health workforce. And I know that's certainly a case that resonates across the Pacific region. And thirdly, as part of building resilient healthcare, in health is also around infrastructure, and that's also what we're doing in Kiribati. So thank you, Anna.
Thanks, Benny. And I might just take us across to perhaps Samoa. So we'll go to the other end of the table to Louise. If you could share what's the aspect of human security that's most concerning in Samoa at this time, and what are you doing about it?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Sorry, you have the mic.
Okay. Okay, and then, okay, test. Test, can you hear me?
I think it's a bit tricky.
Oh, okay.
It's fine.
Okay, yes. Thank you. Well, in thinking about human security and the priorities, and I give my view as an academic Samoan, and in looking at it from the long jury lenses of how we came to be like this. So it's very important. We have a history of persistent vulnerability to external forces since colonization, since the arrival of the first man here in the first outsider who claimed that they discovered us. But those are the things that are often ignored by policymakers, is the richness of our history, and use that history to build strategies to help us improve to advance our livelihoods. But today I've been asked about what human security is for me and for my community. Security is land. Land. We need to secure the land first, because God is not making any more other than the Chinese. Those are the things that we need to be thinking about. And I speak also in the language of common people, that because policies sometimes can be far removed from the lives of the common people. So all these intertwining sort of things that are going on at the moment, and with a strong legislation on land that recognizes the importance of our cultures, because land, and when I say land, it means land and sea. They should not be treated separately, because those are all our cultural scapes as well. And land and sea, and strong legislations to firstly protect the people who are there, the landowners first, and then deal with the external forces second. But many a time I see our legislations being changed to fit the idea and the models of development, and that we are people that are underdeveloped, that need to be developed at a certain pace and at a certain tune played by someone else that is not in the region. So I'm sorry, my views can be quite radical, but that is after 20 or more years of analysis as an academic, and maybe 50 plus years of living in the Pacific. And I'm not worried about the numbers game in the second sense, but it is that I have seen our people and our legislation change. And as a nation as well, we are still young, and as a set of nations that are still young, there is the tendency to be threatened and be bullied by others who have documented that they are helping us. So let's not try and dress the elephant in the room. It is that we are here. Be genuine.
And I think, that idea of how we think about human security and all its, whether we want to use that word complexity. And yesterday, Baron Wanga, the new SG for PIS, he mentioned in his speech, he said the human elements of security must always be at the front of our minds. And what strikes me with what you just said and shared, Louise, is that how when you look at land and sea, of course, it's at the front of our minds and on our doorsteps. Francis, I'd be really keen to get your insights with your experience around what elements of human security that you're seeing, and you're welcome to speak to your community level as well as, of course, your regional hat that you wear.
Thank you so much. And I just want to say, wow, I don't know how I'm going to follow that. You've said everything I want to say, but I think I'll take it from a regional perspective. I think for me, human security, like most adopted terminology from the West, is poorly understood by our people. For me, when I think about human security, I think about wellness and well-being. For most of our people, unfortunately, it's a term like sustainable development. During my time at USP as an academic, and again, just the value of research and bringing that into my current role in the development space, recognizing that we don't do enough across the boundaries. So development-informed academia or higher education, and then academic research and higher education that's been informed by development. And I really think that that's one of the big gaps. But during my time at USP, one of the most interesting studies was a study that was New Zealand aid funded, conducted in Tonga. It was a very large study of about 800 households, and it was in direct response, led by Tongans. I'm not Tongan, these were my colleagues, as Anna has said, from Fiji, of mixed heritage. I won't go into that. And so this study was a direct response to a World Bank statement that people in Tonga were living in, abject poverty, surviving on less than $1 per day. And so a group of Tongan scholars decided that they wanted to unpack what poverty actually meant to Tongans themselves. And the findings were so interesting because they came up with, and they of course had to translate into English, and the nearest correlation was sustainable livelihoods. They talked about relationships, They talked about access to resources such as land and sea, so exactly reinforcing what you have just mentioned. And I think that's one of our biggest problems. When you look at the UN Human Security Handbook 2016, the 5 principles sound good in the English language. So they talk about people-centered, comprehensive, context-specific, prevention orientation, and promotes protection and empowerment of all at the individual and community levels. They also mention, if you go down the full list, they mention cultural rights. But for us in the Pacific, the colonial legacy has meant that culture has been demonized to the point that it's seen as a barrier to development and progress. And only in the last 10 years, I would probably say 5, we've started to see that begin to change in our policies. So at the regional level, that recognition of the role that culture does play and can play as an enabler for sustainable development and for resilience building. Unfortunately, very siloed approaches means that those working in trade are not necessarily talking to those working in culture, those working in law reinforcement, those working in natural resources, those working on climate change. They talk about culture, they talk about traditional knowledge, but they're not talking to each other. And often we're not talking to community. So I think for me, when I talk about wellness and well-being, human security is what it is, but it also is unpacking it from the people's perspective and delivering the service that we've been mandated to provide.
Thank you. And I think, one of the best things about a Pacific framing around human security is this holistic approach. Now, that can also be challenging when we are caught up in a sectoral approach, or as we say in the terminology that is using perhaps internationally accepted language to describe what are very local concepts or ways and approaches. So you've been quite international outside of the Pacific, Nick. In your work, what does human security mean for you, and what do you see as something we really need to be looking at?
Thank you, Anna, and thanks to the previous comments from our panellists. Just excellent, a privilege to be here. So maybe just a couple of reflections. How do we kind of come to this place where human security is actually even considered part of national security, and what does it actually mean? If I reflect on some work we did, it was 20 years ago in northern Thailand, where we were tracking HIV subtypes down different drug trafficking routes. We were trying to find HIV negative injectors, which were difficult to find because they were criminalised. There was no opportunities for prevention efforts. And then over the top of that, the Prime Minister at the time, Thaksin Shinawatra, launched a war on drugs and gave the police extrajudicial powers to kill people caught up as drug dealers. Now, everyone always knows that the easiest people to find are not the dealers, right? They're the users. So what ultimately happened was that thousands, 3,500 people lost their lives during that period. The particular work that we were doing in prevention with our Thai, the Thai colleagues got stopped, and all of a sudden, this public health effort to support and promote health and livelihoods for people really right on the margins was decimated. And so I think, so for me, the idea of what is the role of security actors in supporting human security, right? And so what we saw in that particular time was that if we, that no matter how good our public health human rights work was, it could be decimated, but with the flick of a switch by much more powerful sectors, for example. So for me, that was the first kind of shaping, how I thought about human security and health more generally. And that's when I said to my colleagues, I think we need to engage with the security sector. No one had any engagement with police, ministries of interior, immigration, customs, corrections, public security more generally across the region. So I think similar to George's point yesterday about how many people understood climate change, how many police understood anything about infectious disease, and I think you would have got a similar level of hands yesterday if you'd asked that kind of question. So if I then kind of transpose back into the Pacific, and I've been fortunate enough to work with Eric and others over the last 3 or 4 years, the Boe Declaration is a seminal document. It is global leading in its positioning of human security, and it should be celebrated. I mean, even the numbers of people in this room versus probably what's happening in other rooms at the moment kind of indicates that despite its primacy in the Boe Declaration, it's the understanding and the transposition into operational actions is limited. So I think we have an enormous amount of work to do. But when I work with RFG colleagues, the Ministries of Home Affairs and the people that are trying to put together national security strategies, they understand that if you account for human security and you bring it forward and you give it a platform from which to thrive, you're more unlikely to wind up in political or civil instability, which is kind of the traditional kind of national security framework. Can we prevent political unrest? Well, yes, we can, if we account for human security, which includes food, water, shelter, cultural heritage, etc., etc. So I really think there's an opportunity here in security making, national security making, to open up the platforms for people such as yourselves on the panel, for climate change experts, for public health, for animal, for plant, because then all of a sudden this evolution of national security making, all of a sudden it's not on people, it's with people and for people, and I think that's the opportunity in human security and its primacy in the Boe Declaration. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. And we have 3 people on this panel who are very, public health focused, which is very helpful because we're all freshly out of the pandemic. We know there is COVID still circulating around and it's a bit of a season at the moment. So please do remember to practice your hand washing and sanitizing. But I'm going to pass us to perhaps someone who is incredibly familiar with the world of pandemic preparedness and management. And so, Eric, when we think about where human security sits and what you've experienced in terms of what works and what doesn't, where do you think we should be looking at regionally? What are some of your concerns or opportunities that you see at present about where we take this gift of Boe looking at human security?
Thank you, Anna. And I follow the same vein of discussion that's alluded to by my colleagues, also with Nick in terms of health security. And that is why I started with the work on One Health, because for years of working in the Ministry of Health, we've had this constant threat of bacterial agents, infectious diseases, zoonotic infectious diseases. These are diseases that affect both animals and humans, or animals coming to humans, and can be from humans to animals in rare circumstances. So after years, you get really frustrated in the medical field with dealing these ongoing emerging agents from internationally, globally, even from other regions. And sometimes these agents are exacerbated by climate change and environments that make these agents. When I'm talking about agents, whether it's bacterial, virus. So from the technical point of view, One Health was a very attractive idea or concept in where there's collaboration. There's also a transdisciplinary approach across these 3 major technical sectors, and that's environment or the ecosystem, the human health or public health, and agriculture or animal health. So across these 3 areas, this One Health approach looks at the different levels at regional, national, community level, even to the individual level, looking for solutions, because these sectors traditionally are acting as silos for years. Traditionally, they behave in silos, and the whole concept of One Health is to bring them together and look at solutions and ensuring that each one has the same responsibility for a specific issues. So globally, you have this consortium. I don't know if you've heard of the quadripartite consortium on One Health. So you have these UN agencies of World Health Organization, WHO, FAO, UNEP, and WOAH, World Organization of Animal Health, signing an agreement to work on addressing issues common to these major agencies or specialty fields or technical areas that addresses common issues like zoonotic infectious disease, food security, and so many. But looking at the human security side of things within our region, you also have specific concerns. And of course, top of the list is climate change, its impact on human health, as I've alluded to in terms of infectious diseases, its impact on agriculture. And agriculture can be on the sides of pest diseases, also on animal health in terms of introduction of animal diseases that we don't historically have in our Pacific Islands. And we also have the environment, and we've had these discussions on climate change and health. And so if you look at the way I look at human security, that's why my colleague on my left invited me here, is that you're basically looking at threats as as by definition of security. And using these technical areas to protect and secure our region from this, whether it's from the border or whether it's from the programmatic side, or whether you are looking at collaborating with these UN agencies that are already committed to this One Health approach within the region. So, as you know, everyone has gone through the experience of COVID, and an important COVID lesson is that the health sector cannot handle such a massive biological event. It requires sectorial approach in terms of collaborating, a transdisciplinary across the different disciplines to effectively respond to a large biological event like a pandemic, or even in countries, outbreaks and so. So that's my small spiel on human security in terms of ensuring that we also protect our community, the individual, by enhancing this collaboration across these three sectors. And thereby also, my presence here is linking up with our security colleagues, with our colleagues at the Pacific Security College and other partners to ensure that these three sectors are not working on their own, but also working with the other security partners. Lastly, I want to say that we're also advancing a step further in terms of establishing a governance group within the Pacific, a network. And so far I've got a paper was presented to the heads of health, that's all the permanent secretaries and the CEOs, on the One Health approach that has been endorsed and advocated for by the permanent secretaries of health in the Pacific. Similarly, that has been done with the permanent secretaries of agriculture in getting their advocacy and support towards this One Health approach in the region. We'll be moving to security, the formal security groups and other groups, especially our colleagues from environment or the ecosystem health, and thereby fulfilling our obligations together, working together to achieve human security. Thank you.
Thanks, and I'm going to take us back to Kiribati, if I may, to think about this, the value of this collaborative approach, and perhaps that's what's new, even though we're saying we know that human security is very much this idea of being about well-being and safety for our Pacific peoples. We're using the language of human security now in the way that perhaps the UN and now the Boe Declaration has done that. And collaboration is being required on in perhaps different ways, as we've just heard. Now, Kiribati, I know Benny had to experience not only the pandemic, but also quite a major drought. And so I'd be interested to hear from you in terms of how did collaboration work and what worked well in your context in terms of tackling these human security challenges.
Thank you. And just to congratulate the speakers on such excellent points alluded to earlier. So in terms of collaboration, I think, the key highlight of collaboration in the case of Kiribati in the context of health was really highlighted in during COVID-19. It was a new profound area for everyone. And, in the context of Kiribati, it was really just pulling all the resources together. And that was, it was a matter of survival. And that was where we were able to survive as a nation, as communities, as individuals, because we were able to pull in every sector. So we had health, we had police, we had all the legal enforcement areas come together. We had the private sector, because obviously we didn't have enough security services available in the country. So we had, the private sector coming in to provide that security as well. We didn't have enough police officers on the ground. In terms of our healthcare providers, we didn't have enough. And so we relied on the NGOs, and that's where everyone just really came together. And it was a profound example of how collaboration came to fruition and the success of collaboration. And I think that was the key highlight for Kiribati. As we move forward, as a post COVID-19, in the post-COVID-19 era, we continue to see the importance of health, and this is well encapsulated in the policies that have been developed. The Kiribati National Climate Change Policy incorporates health security and identifies that as a key area of collaboration. But there's definitely a gap, and I think it's something, there's a very small understanding on the impacts of climate change in health. And I think this is what we really need to work on, together as partners as well, and governments. It's really about getting that information out so that communities can better understand the impacts of climate change and health, and more so that all the sectors can understand their role in the impacts of climate change throughout all the sectors, including health. Thank you.
Thanks, Benny. And so to Louise, because I know you do a lot in your community, but also just picking up on the points that you raised earlier around how human security is land and sea. And we've talked about, well, who are the actors that we need to engage with when we're seeking to support human security? Well, Benny's mentioned private sector CSOs as well as, the usual suspects, so to speak. From your perspective, Louise, what does the sort of a community effort and relationship with government institutions need to look like to be effective around human security or advancing human security, particularly on your earlier points?
Yeah. Sorry. Just if one thinks about our own communities and how the regional frameworks should be leveraged against the domestic policies, a couple of things come to mind. One is the capacity building of the workforce, and the understanding also of, and I remain true that you've got to know your history and how you came to that space. If you look at our people, we're all calling that the critical social problem, trying to identify where do we inject, whereabouts in the life cycle of the human being do you start to do an intervention, because we're so obese now. And for many times, NUS research has been calling, start with the women's health. And not every, just because there is something that is wrong or there's pain, requires pharmaceutical intervention. We're cultured people. There's that spirituality element that policies also, writers also, they tend to flick that one out of the room while they write the policy, because it's something that's so difficult to hone in. And so our policies are reflecting things that are easy to resolve. But if you look at the women's health, for example, where do you start to do that? By looking after them during the maternal time, when they're pregnant. If you look around our region, how many of our hospitals are baby friendly? Because I tell you, Samoa failed the scorecard big time. The policies of breastfeeding, fa'asusu le tama, to angai fa'asusu, it was turned into some sort of funny joke. But there, the subtlety of change, you don't know it, but it's happening. You're being fed, you're being invaded through ideas. Look around also, because we tend to see with our eyes. But look around the Pacific too, and how the Pacific is being militarized at the moment, right in front of our eyes. And the ideas of geopolitics, the moving parts of the puzzle. And I get this by these sort of analysis by, I teach the Boe Declaration to our Pacific history students. And so I always seek their view of analysis, the view that they saw in Dave Peoples' readings, because that's how we're capacity building. That's how we're teaching. We take these documents from, as one of my students whose English is not very, from PEEF and SPC, and we turn them into documents to help put them in the curriculum, to educate our next generation of public servants. So when they come out, they are aware of the regional frameworks and how it's reflected on the ground. And those are very important things to be thinking about. So when they get the chance to write policies, they write policies that are aligned to that DNA of regional policies in thinking about it. But and how the movement from regional to domestic, it's not going to be easy, because we all have our different, we are different sovereigns. We all have our different views, and we see the world differently based on our on the people that we choose to be friends with at the highest level. And then one of the other things to be thinking about with this is the idea of funding and resourcing, because that always has been a persistent problem, is who's funding this? And then we sit and then shelve all these good things, all these good ideas. A classic example of that is the pledge with the gender that has been reactivated, and then the younger generation think that it's new, but no, 2013 it was signed by the region, and then shelved. I don't know why, because back in Samoa, I had as an assessor of all these documents. Well, I appoint myself an assessor because I'm an academic, and that is what I do. And I assessed these documents, and I was very happy when Pledge came, because that shone a new light to the things that we do as women, that bring the women to the center stage, and all the connectedness of women as individuals, and the multiplicity of ourselves. That we fail to, we ignore those sort of things, because you want things black and white. Once they're black and white, it's held, it's that. But there are other gray areas there that you need to address. And those are the things that we have to be careful with. So those are some of the things that I try to make, but we're making, and universities also are some brilliant research that are out there. Our people out there making writing about climate change and climate change in all the different sectors of our lives. The project that by POCA, I met some brilliant USB professors who are doing work out in the communities. I came a couple of months ago and worked with Vunisinu community, a community that is sinking and suffering poverty as well. But I live in poverty, and because people have put that down. On whose scale are we looking at now? But I am okay, personally. So those are the politics surrounding our existence and the politics surrounding the dilemma at the moment. But I go back to how did we come like this? And the answer is there too. With the vulnerabilities, with the persistent vulnerability, it really has trained us subtly that to be resilient, and as a community that has the longest vulnerability persistent in that case, we have also built resilient views and resilient ways of lives to move forward. But we need to move with coordination as a Pacific family, helping each other and not having some of our family members run off and do deals for themselves and leave the Pacific family.
Thank you. And I think my takeaway from that really very eloquent intervention is also that there are many facets to human security. We've established it's quite a complex and multifaceted area, but it's extending from the land and sea to the human individual, to the community, to the island, to the state, and also in the region now through Boe Declaration. And so with that complexity, including political ideologies, including emerging zoonotic situations and bacteria and all sorts of environmental factors as well, it's requiring a different type, perhaps, of collaboration. And on health, we've heard about some very important and effective collaborations that happened we heard from Kiribati and Fiji, where that worked in the pandemic. But what I'm hearing from you, Louise, is there's actually other kinds of collaboration needed too on human security that help tackle this interface between the human and what is going to give us that security and resilience. So then the big question is, well, then what can we do at the regional level? So I'm going to ask those who work in the regional level, Francis, to say, well, what can we do regionally on human security in a meaningful way in the Pacific?
Gee, thanks.
And we can come to the audience too very soon.
I think this really is the key question, and I had alluded to, and others had as well, the status quo of working in silos. And we all have a shared goal, and there's so many overlaps. Because we are so heavily dependent on aid, it means inefficient use of the resources that we have, because we're in many instances replicating or duplicating pieces of work where we could be working so much better together. So at the regional level, what we've seen is a renewed thinking about culture, and I'm going to come back to culture as my reference point because that's the work that I lead. And so what we've seen is through the Pacific Regional Culture Strategy, which is available online if you haven't seen it, 2022 to 2032. That was such an interesting experience for me. Prior to coming to SPC, I had been brought on as the lead consultant to write the Regional Culture Strategy in 2018 and working with countries. And countries were saying exactly what you're saying, Louise, about policies. And the challenge that they put on the table for me was, we don't want a sterile Palangi looking document. We want a policy that looks like us, that feels like us, that we can see ourselves in. And I thought, well, great, but what does that look like? We don't want to see a list of values and principles that are neatly defined in the English language but means nothing to the way that we're doing on the ground. We would like to see ourselves reflected. So if you do have an opportunity to look at the Pacific Regional Culture Strategy, you'll see the ways that we had gone about that particular exercise, working very closely with community. As a spin-off of that, we've had impact in the 2050 itself, and you're starting to see the way that culture is treated. In the past, and I challenge each one of us in the room here to go to any of our previous regional policies or reports. PDF document, do a word search for culture. You will find culture predominantly in the preamble or in the introduction, really fluffy, emotive language. We are our culture, our heritage is who we are, it's our identity, our deep connection to land, sky, and sea. Then you get to the priorities, the indicators, the objectives, culture disappears. It's like all rhetoric. Today, when you search some of these big documents, you see that starting to change. And I think that that is a direct result of crop agencies working better together, of bringing like-minded people to the table. What we had initiated last year was the first Culture Talk Roundtable, bringing together representatives from all crop agencies and UN interagencies with a culture mandate or culture in their programming to look at the different pieces of work that they're doing. So it's a wide range from climate change to health to early childhood education, basic education, higher education, the list goes on, right? And for the first time being able to say, oh, actually, that's what we've started to do as well. We didn't realize that you're well on that journey. And so just having those opportunities and platforms, I think, are so important. I do know that there's a little bit of apprehension when it comes to these regional working groups. So we very purposefully did not call it a working group. It's a culture talk roundtable. People come to the table willingly. It's very informal, but at the same time, we all feed into the delivery of the regional culture strategy and the 2050. We've also seen some really interesting traction when it comes to PACREF, which is the Pacific Regional Education Framework, and the way that education now, at least, is beginning to recognize the critical role of culture and languages. In the previous regional Pacific framework, PERF, and the initial Foreign Basic Education framework, culture was demonized. And basically the statement being that Pacific students don't know how to learn. You actually find language like this in those documents. And Pacific teachers don't know how to teach. So basically we need to be indoctrinated even more in Western ways of thinking and doing and learning in order to achieve. Whereas today, culture is seen as that enabler. To say, well, actually, our worldviews and our ways of being and doing must inform education. Education fails our children, not the other way around. So we're seeing that in education as well. We're also seeing that in conservation, in fisheries. We're seeing amazing traction when it came to the BB&J. It was very, very hard work, the law of the sea. But we managed to get traditional knowledge recognized. More recently, we've seen the WIPO Treaty on traditional knowledge in relation to genetic resources. We're still waiting for the main treaty on the protection of traditional knowledge, but it seems like that's coming to a close shortly, so that's something else to look out for. And a very pleasant also achievement has been in tourism. And so we have the Sustainable Pacific Tourism Policy Framework, which is led by SPTO. Culture is one of the three main priorities or goals. And so it's how do we work, or how do the tourism operators work ethically with indigenous communities, recognizing that for most of us, that's our livelihood. But at the same time, it has a very negative impact, or can have, in terms of environment, in terms of culture loss and language loss. So really taking on more of that social responsibility perspective. So I think really, at the end of the day, what we've seen at the regional level is rather than being competitive, and we heard that in the last session as well, is really coming to the table and recognizing that we're all serving the same region. We have the same goal. How do we work better together? One of the ways that we've started changing that at SPC, which I'm very proud of, is purposeful use of the terminology institutional custodian. And you're starting to hear that take on at PIFs and other regional organizations as well. The reason that we spearheaded that as part of our culture work is because when you say you're a crop agency or regional agency, it's a very Western institutional framework. This is our strategic plan, these are our objectives, these are our programs, etc. But when you use the word custodian, suddenly it flips your values. Suddenly it's about serving the community. Suddenly it's more about relationships. And so we very proudly say that we are the regional institutional custodian for the Festival of Pacific Arts and Culture, which is more than an arts festival. It is about safeguarding primarily, and about languages, and about traditional knowledge. And we're also a proud custodian of the Pacific Regional Culture Strategy, which aims to look at culture more holistically across the various sectors. So I really think there was a statement that was said this morning that really kind of stuck in my mind, so I had to write it down. Our job is to make the complex simple and the simple compelling. And what we know about Pacific peoples is the buy-in is when you feel it. It's not when you understand it. It's not head learning. It really is heart knowing. And so you might say you're na'au, or you feel it in your belly, your gut feeling. You know that this is true or truth. There's alternative ways of knowing and being. And what we've found in the culture space is that we've been able to establish those relationships both regionally and with community when you come from that genuine place of shared responsibility and guardianship. And it may not work for everyone, but it certainly worked for us. And we're seeing some interesting new relationships being established that we would have not seen 5 years ago. So I think that's one of the lessons that we've learned, is really just flipping the switch on how we see ourselves and the role that we play and the kinds of relationships that we're trying to cultivate now.
Naka, and if it's all right with Nick and Derek for a moment, I'm going to go to the floor because I want to make sure that we get to have some conversation with the audience. And if there's anybody who'd like to kick off any questions or comments and re-engage with the panel, that would be great.